So if you're interested in assessing, let's say, communication skills of some kind in your students, let's say you want to assess oral communication skills, your assessment should address their ability to communicate orally, right? Should assess maybe things like composure, eye contact, speaking clearly, something like that. So you're thinking about all of the different criteria that would be on there, and that should address the skill that you're trying to assess. So that would make it more valid. When some people imagine this course, 398T, maybe one of the first things that might come to mind is, what instructional methods do we use? You know, how do we teach? And sure, that's important. That's definitely important to know different strategies you can use when you teach. But I would argue that maybe even more important is the learning that's taking place. So as much as possible, I try to communicate with my students that we're not just talking about what we do when we're teaching. We are also very invested in what our students are learning and what they're doing. And assessment basically helps us measure how much students are learning. When we talk about assessment of students, I wanted to show this graphic first, because it reminds us to consider all three of these components when developing a course, when planning instruction, any of that. We want to consider all three of these things, and the arrows pointing in both directions for all three are intentional. So we can see that, you know, we've tried to emphasize that goals and objectives are definitely the things that you want to establish first when you're planning your course. So once you've decided on what your own goals are for the course and what you want the students to be able to do by the end of the course, then the next other things you would consider then are your assessment methods and your instructional methods. But both of those should trace back to your objectives, right? I like talking about it with my students, because I kind of like to perhaps broaden their definition of assessment and not just talk about grading, for example. That assessment, to me, can be done in class, can be done as an exam, or it can be even part of a discussion. For me to assess whether students are learning, I even would count nonverbal communication as a way for me to assess whether they're learning. So, you know, I may be speaking to them about a particular topic. I look around the room and I see some nods, I see some confused looks, and I use that to help me gauge whether or not I'm pacing myself right or giving correct information or clear information. But so for them to realize that that's a form of assessment, I think is an important thing for them to know, so that they can utilize those kinds of practices when they teach. That, you know, maybe a question and answer session is enough for you to assess whether students have learned during that class period. Maybe it kind of matches what the rest of the class, but they just they can't stop from continuing to make these kinds of comments. What do you do then, if you're the teacher?
Well, you can, again, justify their feelings.
Sure.
And say, I understand you're very frustrated, and so I am willing to speak to you after class, so individually, so we can talk about the test.
You know, other classroom assessment techniques that they could use as in-class activities that may or may not even be a part of the student's grade. So the importance of assessment, again, to broaden their views of assessment, where we're talking about things that are graded, things that are not, you know, low stakes versus high stakes, you know, using formative assessments, so that students have the opportunity to practice what they're learning. All of those things, you know, have to be part of a 398T course.